a leader, you usually don't expect a leader to be described as someone who's impetuous, because a leader is supposed to always have things in control, not an impulsive, rash person. So I want us to take a look at this and see how this title can be applied for good leadership as well. All right. So basically, what we're going to look at this evening is we're going to look at 4 encounters. I've named them the first encounter up to the fourth encounter, but they're not necessarily in chronological order. I've just chosen 4 encounters that we should look at. In addition to this, we're going to look at what the Acts of the Apostles, the book, has to say about our person of the day, which is Peter. And then afterwards, we can try and look at the lessons that we can learn from this. All right, so I'm going to start with our first encounter right now. So the first encounter, which is ironically also the first encounter Peter had with Jesus Christ, this happened at Lake Gennesaret, right? And basically, for us to understand how Jesus and Peter met there, we need to understand what exactly Peter was doing there. So Peter was a fisherman by trade, and he originated from Bethsaida, the city of Bethsaida, but he was residing in Capernaum due to his career as a fisherman, right? So basically, how Peter encountered Jesus was that Jesus came to Peter there as they were, I think they were from fishing, and the Savior came to ask if he could use Peter's boat because he wanted to share the word with some people. So Peter agreed to it. And right there, even before he knew it, Peter had become an agent of ministry because, he provided a place where ministry could happen. So in turn there, he had already become a minister, right? So after Jesus had finished sharing with the people and they were back, Jesus now asks Peter to go and let out his nets. And imagine the situation that Peter was in was that he was from spending a whole night in vain out there because they had been fishing, but they had caught nothing. So now here comes a man who was from sharing a word with him. I want to believe that something that Jesus said impressed Peter, and it motivated him to give this man a chance. So basically, Peter went against all human reasoning and he exercised an amount of faith. And when he exercised that faith, he proved that divinity is more powerful than humanity rather. So when the fishermen went out there into the lake and they started fishing, they started catching fish, and they caught fish in such abundance that their boats couldn't even carry it. They had to ask their friends to come over. And even when their friends in the other boat came over, the fish were so much that the boats actually began to sink. So being impressed by that, because that was a great miracle, that's something that goes beyond what human beings can do. Seeing that miracle, Peter recognized his unworthiness, and he recognized that he was in the presence of someone big and someone great. And being impressed by that, Jesus actually calls them to become fishers of men, even greater than just basic fishermen. And at that point in time, Peter and the other disciples that he were with decided to leave everything that they were doing, and they decided to follow Christ and become fishers of men. Now, there's a rhetorical question that I have for us. If we look at this, let me give an example. Imagine you are in your last year, in your last semester of school, and you have such an encounter with Jesus. I wonder how many of us in this day and age would actually be willing to leave everything behind. That means leaving behind the degree that you've worked hard for and just dropping it all so that you follow Jesus Christ. All right. So this is the first encounter that we're going to look at. And then the second encounter now that I would like us to examine here is it deals with the storm and the walking on water. So basically what happened here was that after Jesus had fed the 5,000, he sends off his disciples and he tells them to go with a boat and to cross to the other side and he'll follow. He actually tells them that he's going to remain behind, sending the multitudes away. So, to cut the long story short, as these people were sailing through the sea, whilst in the midst of the sea, we see that a storm arises, right? And when this storm arises, human beings also begin to panic. Everyone that's in the boat now starts to worry. They all start getting anxious. They all start thinking that the boat is going to capsize and that everyone is going to die. Now, I think that this is something very peculiar because, when it's raining and there's a storm, you can barely see anything. So now I want to try and put myself in the place of these disciples. It's raining heavily. We're in the midst of the storm. The waves are crashing so hard. And then all of a sudden, a figure is seen in the distance, right? And this figure is like a person. It actually seems more like a ghost. And I'd like to believe that this figure must have been very bright per se, because it's very hard to see a human being in the midst of the storm, especially walking on water. So there must have been something glowing per se about him. So when they see this, they begin to think that it's a ghost or a spirit per se. And when they see this walking on water, it actually adds to the anxiety, right? And as it adds to the anxiety, Jesus then calls out to them and says, yo, these guys, stop worrying. It's me, it's I, right? And then as the disciples get reassured that it's him, Simon Peter now here presents himself as, the one who wants solid evidence that it is Jesus Christ, right? So he tests the spirit and he asks, okay, if it's you, if you are Jesus as you claim to be, call me out and let me walk on the water. So as Jesus calls Peter out and he walks on the water, there's another example of another miracle being worked in Peter's life. And I want to believe that all these miracles that were happening in the presence of Peter, they all built a foundation for him to become a great leader later on, right? Even as he continued to walk with Jesus, his faith was moved in various ways. So as he begins to walk on the water, he sees now that your divinity is definitely way greater than humanity. And then now I think the magnitude of the situation just got the best of him. And then because he loses sight of Jesus Christ in this situation, now the human nature starts to exactly is this happening. And then because he loses sight of Jesus Christ in this situation, we see that Peter begins to sink, right? He lost sight of the Savior and he starts to sink. So then he cries to the Lord and he asks God to save him, or rather, he asks Jesus to save him in this situation. And then Jesus comes to grab a hold of his hand and he asks him a seriously soul searching question. And he says, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And so we see that as this progresses, Jesus Christ and Peter get back into the boat. And the moment they're back in the boat, the storm ceases, and all who are present there magnify and they worship Jesus Christ. Right. So this is the second encounter. And then now the third encounter that I would like us to look at um, is the encounter dealing with the denial of Jesus Christ by Simon Peter. So this, I want to say that the events that led up to this began right after Jesus washed the feet of the disciples. And then because he loses sight of Jesus Christ in this situation, Jesus was talking to all the disciples and after they celebrated, the devil is seeking after him. And then Peter, having confidence in himself, knowing that he loves Jesus so much, he goes to his and he says basically that he's willing to go to the ends of the earth for Jesus Christ. And then Jesus tells Peter that in as much as you're saying all this, before the cause, trust me, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. So now, as the time progressed, Jesus is taken into captivity after this whole encounter at Simon there, and from a distance, and then he comes into the place where they were gathered. And then when he reaches there, he is recognized by a maid who claims that Peter was one of those who was walking with Jesus. And Peter denies it. A second time, someone else comes forward and looks at him and gives him a glance and says that you look familiar. You actually look like someone who walked with Jesus. And again, he denies it. The third time, think about an hour after the last denial, Peter is recognized again. And after being recognized, he denies Jesus Christ again. And almost simultaneously, even before he finishes his whole defense and even before he finishes his full denial, Jesus gave a look was the look of boldness, right? And in that moment, Peter recalls what the Lord had said earlier. And because he's so heartbroken and so disappointed in himself, Peter leaves and he starts to weep bitterly. I want to believe that this was also another time where Peter grew and something that led him to become a great leader. Right. The fourth and final encounter that we're going to look at is the one that talks about Peter being a rock, and on this rock, Christ will build his church. All right. So this encounter happened actually on the coast of Caesarea Philippi. And Jesus was talking to the disciples, and they were gathered there, and he asked the disciples who people say he is. And then the disciples answered and said that, some people think that you're a follower of John the Baptist and all that. And then Jesus Christ now asks them a direct question. Okay, people think that I'm that. What do you guys think I am? Right? And Peter gives the correct answer per se. And he says that you are the Lord, the Son of Man, and the Son of God. And at that moment, the Lord blesses him and he calls him the rock upon which his church shall be built. Right? So now, after receiving that blessing from Jesus Christ, Jesus now starts to warn the disciples about all the suffering that he must go through in order to fulfill the plan of redemption, right? Now, I want to believe that Peter was feeling excited in this moment. We know that Peter is an impetuous person. He doesn't really think things through properly sometimes. So at this point in time, he's bold enough to actually rebuke Jesus, and he says that, oh, these things can't happen to you. And then now Christ reprimands him because he knows that these things were contrary to the will of God, and he says, "Get thee behind me, Satan," right? Because Peter spoke words which were not from God, right? And Jesus goes on to tell the disciples that in order for them to follow him, they must deny themselves and forget about themselves, right? So this is the fourth encounter. Later on, we're going to look at what all these encounters can teach us as leaders. So I was saying that there's a book called The Acts of the Apostles by Ellen G. White. Chapter 51 is a dedicated chapter which talks about the writings of Simon Peter. And the title of the chapter is actually A Faithful Under Shepherd. So I want us to establish how Peter came to become this shepherd, right? So from Luke chapter 22, verse 32, Jesus said these words to Peter, and it says that when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. So once Peter was to receive his conversion, he was going to have a duty to strengthen the people of God. And then in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, it says, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So Peter was supposed to be a firm foundation, a foundation upon which the church was supposed to be built. And obviously, being a foundation meant that he had a duty as a shepherd to keep things in check, to be a shepherd of the flock. He had had a personal experience with Jesus Christ. he had walked with Jesus Christ for so in all the times past, especially as Peter passed through so many disappointed so many times that he took down the things and he was also supposed to be so spread as an educator. So I think I ended where we were talking about Peter. Hello?
Hello. We can hear you.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
And can you see the screen? See that because he had been educated for active service, influence has spread so much, he actually became one of the founders of the early church. And it goes in accordance with what Jesus Christ said, that upon this rock I will build my church. So we come to see that even through his mentor, even when he grew old, his ministry and his leadership role didn't rest. He didn't end it. Prior to his death, we see that Peter wrote the book, the epistles of First and Second Peter, right? And in writing the books, he right, that we are under shepherd. I want to life of Peter. All right. My slide show is not moving. Okay. All right. We look at the lessons to learn from the life of Peter. Okay. So, in as much as a leader has to have other qualities, the foundation of ministry, first of all, is love for God, right? And when we look at the book of John, chapter 21, verses 15 to 16, it says that when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to them, he said to him, rather, feed my lambs. And he said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And then Jesus replied and said to him, tend my sheep. So we see that Jesus Christ asked this again, and Peter gives the same response. And after that, Peter is told to feed the sheep, right?
So I want to believe that the sheep and the lamb represent two different groups of people, and Peter was given a responsibility um, over these two groups of people. So he was given a duty to feed the lamb. And now we know that I want to believe that the lamb represent those who are spiritually inexperienced and the unbelievers because they represent something that is young, something that's inexperienced. So Peter was given a duty to feed these, and in feeding them, he was supposed to feed them in such a manner that they grow and come to an understanding and acceptance of the Lord Jesus Christ. He was also given a responsibility to tend and feed the sheep. So we know that these are meant to represent those who had already grown in faith, those who had already come to accept Jesus Christ. He was supposed to tend and feed them. So, taking care of them and feeding them. And in doing so, he was supposed to equip them for ministry and leadership as well. Right. And then the second lesson that I want us to learn is that there are no qualifications that are needed for ministry, right? There's no certain class that is designed to be a leader or a minister. We understand that Peter was a simple fisherman, right? But he became the rock upon which the church was built. So he was a simple fisherman. He wasn't even from a high class in society. And I love the fact that the Bible is always direct in specifying these things because I believe that they are direct lessons. It doesn't matter where you're from. He was from a basic city, he was from that side, not from anywhere elegant, but he still became a powerful leader and he came to do great things under the influence of Jesus Christ and under the influence of God. Right. Another lesson that I would like us to draw from this is that our personal traits and experiences are a powerful asset in ministry, right? So from the way we've seen Peter in some of these encounters, we've come to see that Peter is a very bold and outspoken person. He was a very bold and outspoken person. And we know that outspoken people are those that get the word of God spread and shared. So we know that being bold and outspoken was a good quality and it was needed for spreading the gospel. We actually find that in other encounters, Peter was actually the main spokesperson for the disciples, right? But there are certain times when we see that his boldness and him being outspoken often led to problems. And in these problems, he was humbled and he was also reproved and reprimanded and he learned certain lessons. We also understand that Peter was quite impulsive. Just imagine the way he was inspired by God. He had built a career of fishing, and the moment he was just impressed by one thing, he needed no more proof, no more evidence. Immediately, he decided that that was the way he was going to go, right? And then, when impressed by Jesus on his first encounter with him, he instantly decided to follow him. Yeah, so that's basically what I was saying. On another occasion, rather, he was made to walk on water, but he started to sink when he lost sight of God. I think that was a lesson to him on how elevating the mind by focusing on divinity overcomes the storms of life. And we know that elevating the mind and focusing on Jesus Christ and on God is one of the foundations of leadership. Because if you're leading without focusing on God, then your leadership is taking you nowhere. So I believe that that encounter there when he walked on water changed him in a certain way, and it altered his faith and his mindset. So Peter had such confidence in the love he had for Jesus, but he even ended up betraying him. I think it was a wake up to the reality. He said something, but at the end of the day, he couldn't deliver on what he said he could. So I think it instilled a degree of humility in him, coming to an understanding he needed the divine power to work with him, right? Peter had certain times, because of human nature, he was used for the devil's cause. Peter had certain times because of human nature, he was used for the devil's cause. He even ended up rebuking Jesus Christ. Now we know that all this can be attributed to how bold he was. But I think that having learned all his weaknesses, it equipped him to be a powerful leader. So sometimes all these disappointing situations that we may go through, they're just a stepping stone for becoming greater leaders. And then as we are looking at and examining personal traits, I wanted us to also understand one thing, that because of our personal traits and our experiences, our leadership then becomes unique because we are all different people. No person has the same combination of experiences and characteristics as the next person. So every leader is going to leave a different mark, united in purpose, but then it's definitely going to be different. We see that John, Peter, Paul, all these biblical leaders left a different impact, even though all of their impacts led to the advancement of the kingdom of God, right? So the fourth lesson rather that I think that we can learn from this is that proximity to Christ is needed as a Christian leader. So the nearness of being close to Jesus Christ is needed. Peter had a personal relationship with Jesus. He was actually one of the closest disciples to Jesus, and he played a big leadership role even while Jesus was still on earth. So we come to understand that the closer we are to Jesus, the more he can train us to be good leaders, and he points out all of our mistakes and he helps us to capitalize on our strengths. So we see that Peter was often called when healing was taking place. Peter was actually one of the first to see Jesus when he came out of the tomb. So all these things, the proximity, being close to Christ, it built him to become a good leader, right? And then the fifth and final lesson that I would like us to learn from Peter is that our age and circumstances must not hinder or stop ministry. So even in Peter didn't stop working for. So previous his death, the people were going through a tough time, actually great tribulation. He wrote the first and second epistles of Peter, and we come to understand that these books that were written are still ministering to people even in this day. So I think that it's a sign that great leaders will always leave their mark, and their mark sometimes may even outlive them. Peter's influence is still affecting our lives right now. We are still looking at his books and we're using his books um, to give us a guide on how to be good Christians even in this day, right? So he didn't let age stop him from ministering, and then he showed that the leader never stops leading. In another examination, we come to understand also that Peter showed that a leader is not selective, right? So in his Petrine epistles, these same books, he addresses the stranger in the churches in Asia Minor, all those churches that were listed there, especially in the first epistle. There were churches in Asia Minor, right? And these churches were dominated by the Gentile Christians rather than the Jewish Christians. So even though the Jewish Christians were a minority in the area, Peter didn't show any partiality, and he addressed both groups that were living there in the heathen land. So he addressed them, and he didn't show any favoritism of any sort. He didn't show any partiality, right? In addition to addressing the different groups, he also made sure that his leadership was also all inclusive. So when Peter was writing those letters, he didn't leave anyone out, and that's what a leader should do. A leader shouldn't leave anyone out. We shouldn't be leaders of only children per se, or leaders of only adults. He addressed all age groups as he was writing. He addressed husbands, he addressed wives, he addressed elders, he addressed the youth and the servants inclusive. So he demonstrated in that a good leader must be all inclusive. So we know that there's so many other situations or encounters that can be examined at the end of the day. But that's what I felt could be shared regarding Peter. Right. So that's basically all I had regarding Peter. Thank you. I don't know if there's anyone who has anything else to say.
We can have questions or contributions.
Pardon?
I'm saying we can have questions and contributions.
Okay, yeah. I think we can go for that.
I want to say a really good study and teaching for the Chileleko. Hope I got your name right.
Yes.
So, really, Peter is one outstanding character that every time we study, I get to study or we get to study about Peter. It's always amazing how far he came through. So the thing is, I don't know, he's one leader that had so many lapses, so many weaknesses, which you've helped, even you brought back to our memories, like um the from his actions. And it seemed like right from the beginning, when God even picked him up, or when God called him, God already saw the leadership traits in him, even at the lowest point where God met him, or that beginning point. We could see that he wasn't perfect, but God already saw, like, the amazing. God was already even grooming him, because God brought him close, and from the Bible scriptures which you read, it said, God even told him, "Feed my sheep, take care of my flock." So he's one person that we could even see that, okay, he was sort of he was under the mentorship of God, of Jesus Christ, I mean to say. He was like a disciple. Like, all of them were disciples, but he was like the leading kind of disciple that God called him. And his humility, and even his failures, I'm saying, and his humility, his strive towards trying to get things right, is an encouragement to me as a Christian, and me as a leader as well. Because even I believe there were so many, all the disciples were called to be leader, but he was like the head of the Christian church, at the new church at that point in time. I feel also Judas was also called to be a leader, because even while he was a disciple, he also was a leader. He was the one in charge of the post, right? But when I compare and contrast Peter to Judas, I could see that you made the word, Rachel, you made the word, you say he betrayed Jesus Christ, and I was like, in my mouth, like, was that a betrayal? Okay, he denied Jesus. Could we also say he betrayed Jesus? But in real sense, it was sort of a betrayal, because someone, you're like, I don't know them, so I was like, it's a betrayal. So here we're saying, from that, it makes me understand that both Judas and Peter betrayed Jesus Christ, but one still stood up. One still went back to Jesus Christ. One still went to ask for forgiveness. One did not allow his weakness or his shortcoming to push him away from the truth, to drive him away from Jesus Christ, from salvation. So that's also, there are many things, like you pointed out, that really, if we see such characters in someone today, we'll say, this guy should not be a leader, or this guy should get out of here. He's not born to be a leader, or he's a failure, he cannot lead, and we just put those people aside. But then Peter overcame all those weaknesses, and he grew out of it, and he even helped him in how he led the church. So I just wanted to contribute that in, bring that in.
Thank you so much for that contribution.
Thank you, Chileleko, for the presentation. I have a question. Peter, for me, is one of those characters in the Bible, because I always ask myself, why is it there was so much greater attention that was given to the life of Peter than any other disciple in the Bible? And some of the conclusions I've come to is because if I look at us as Christians today, we relate so much to Peter. We are Peters in one way or the other. Just to pick one example of Peter, when the soldiers and Judas came to take Jesus after they were in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see Peter drawing his knife and cutting one of the soldier's ear, and Christ rebukes him and then takes the ear, puts it back. But then when people asked him, aren't you one of the Jesus followers? He said no. What strikes me about this is when Peter was among, let me say, church members, was among his fellow brethren, he was so energized to defend Christ. But when he found himself against people when he found himself in the midst of people that were not his brethren, in a sense, he then shied away and denied Christ. It seems like that's what we do when we're among our fellow Adventists, our fellow Christians. We talk so much about Christ. We defend religion. We defend our beliefs. But that moment we find ourselves when no one from church or from who believes what we believe is around, we tend to do the opposite. My question is, why? Why is that the case?
Can I answer this one?
Yes.
Hello? Yeah, can you hear me? You can? Okay. I think on an adjudication, it's like to understand Peter from from both ends, why he did what he did, and certain justifications. It goes back to us. The incident that happened when in the garden, when he cut off the soldier's ear and then Jesus put it back. I think at that very point, it dawned to him that maybe this thing is about to collapse, like, and then Jesus is taken away and this is his best friend, and it is what it was, and for him to still say, I'm part of him when he saw him being captured, it did not make. So even to us, there are times where people, Lefkosa Church is not the church or whatsoever. People are doing this and that and that and that and that and that and that. And then because you forget the actual foundation. By the way, I wanted to correct one thing. Like when Jesus said, Peter, this rock is the foundation. He meant himself. So sometimes we get to a point whereby we forget that God is the foundation, and then we look at ourselves, and then we think now it's solely our responsibility, and then it becomes so much pressure, and hence you deny, because you yourself cannot manage the ministry of God by yourself. So it's time we were clouded and we see things crumbling, we see the church of God going through this and that. Therefore, we lose sight of the bigger picture. So I do believe all of us, we doubt because sometimes situations are actually giving us the reason to doubt. But then the actual thing is, God is always there for us, even if we cannot see him, even we cannot see the end goal, we need to basically keep with the plan. Therefore, everything will work out well. So I think it's because of fear, and then what we can see is what we can see, and what we cannot see is not what we cannot see. That's what I think. Hello?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I think that answers the question now. We fear so much of, either because of what we're seeing going around, or we fear what people may think. And also the other thing is we fear to stand alone. I believe there's something that, one thing also I've been noticing from the difference between most of the leaders we've been discussing, that at the end of the day, they learn that in this ministry, in this life, sometimes you have to stand alone, or it seems you're standing alone because you can see other people standing with you. But you have to have the courage to stand alone and know that you're not alone. Christ is with you in that moment. Because the moment you fear people secluding you because of what you believe, and how you carry yourself, you then get into the place whereby you compromise, hence you then, like Brother Tuchuk was saying, you deny Christ, you betray Christ because you're saying you don't know him. You're not representing him when you're supposed to. So thank you, Brother Isaac, for that contribution.
Can I chip in some? I think also, okay, Peter himself was an impulsive guy, as clearly noted, and so he acts. Then later he thinks what he has done. So many of us are like that. Like sometimes I find myself like that as well. I act, and then later on in my spare time, I'm like, this is what I did. I didn't come to that realization while I was acting. But I think also, for many of us, the reason why we deny people on the outside is because I don't know, at some point in time, we need to move from being followers to even being leaders. In the sense that, as a follower, I don't know, Peter wanted to, at the point in time, defend Christ because Christ was there. But then, when Christ was not there, he wasn't in charge, or he could not really take charge of his thoughts or what he did and things like that. And basically we're looking for that physical manifestation of maybe Jesus Christ for us to be able to say, yes, I'm a Christian. So in a sense, maybe when there's a miracle or something good happens and people are like, yeah, I'm a Christian, that's why, and then we want to boast of that. But then maybe when now a lot of things, some things are not attached, some negative things are attached to Christianity, so we want to deny Jesus Christ because of that, because of those negative things. So, but I feel like somehow it's because most of us are only following, and we're not even learning to be leaders of ourselves. So when we're in the church, we are all following the pastor or the minister, and then we can now, like, yeah, we're Christians. Hallelujah, I'm a follower of Christ. But then when we now go outside, where I think there's a point where we move from now even following to even saying, okay, yes, I'm not just a follower, I'm also, Christ has called me to lead myself, or Christ has given me that consciousness for me to even, stand, even when there are no members there to back me up, when there's nothing in the physical to back me up. But then I can now consciously pronounce my Christianity to people. That is that conscious leading of self. So I think basically there's that on a deep philosophical level, spiritual level. Some people are just learning how to follow, and once their leader is not there, they basically do not know what to do, so they just back up. But then we're all called to be leaders, even as there's a pastor who is leading us. I'm a follower, I need to follow his directions and instructions. At some point in time, when the pastor is not there, and they said, okay, who is coordinating, or who is deciding things here, and in maybe in Ghana, or even a member can say, okay, yes, I'm a Christian, I want to take charge, wants to give account, wants to stand in gap or something like that. So I feel it's from that deep consciousness of knowing that, okay, we can decide or we can stand for ourselves. we're not just following people or following anything. We are also leaders called to also defend and stand for ourselves and stand in gap for people. I don't know if that clarifies anything.
Can I add as well something else? I think there's this illustration. I'm quite not remembering the whole of it, but then it was comparing between agape love and filial love, which are different types of love. We like from the Greek perspective, and it explains the love that Peter had, which was filial, which is based on conditions and what is it that you're gaining first of all, and so forth. And we remember when there are times where he was asking Jesus, who is going to be mightier among us, and all of these things. And one thing I've learned about Christianity is really sweet when you understand it, right? But we get too comfortable in it to a point whereby when all of those things are now taken away from us, because it's a great controversy. You know, everything is fine. You know, you're preaching sermons, you're moving around, all of these things, and you know, you're the example, right? And then now it just comes to your way now because it's conditional. Now that's where you now say to God, no, this is what I had to do. You know, I have to do it, and you understand. We find ourselves explaining all of these things and stuff and whatever, and then we forget that there are times where things are going to be okay, and there are times things where it's not going to be so good. So our love should not be so filial based on conditions, because as long as it's that, and the logic will always make sense, because I can't be doing this because I see, you know, let me do this on the Sabbath, or do this and that and that. Let me cover these things, and you start doing this math by yourself and everything. But there was a time where you were standing, and then when it comes for time to prove all of these things, you're now questioned, and we don't like to be questioned because most of the time it's based on what? On filial love.
Thank you so much. One other lesson I get from the story, it's more of Jesus teaching the disciples early on in the ministry, when he finds Peter and his brothers washing their nets after an unsuccessful night of fishing. I believe it was deliberate that they didn't find anything. I believe nothing happens without a reason, because these were professional fishermen and this was something that was unusual to happen. But when Christ then came to them and pointed to them where to cast their nets, and they did so, and they found what they had been looking for the whole night. The lesson that I learned and I would share to you guys is, as leaders, we might have all the skills. You might be a born leader. You might have the talent. You might be outspoken. You might be good in public speaking. You know, you might be well read and well versed and have the knowledge of the Bible. But your part in the ministry will never bear fruits as long as you doing it alone and Christ hasn't pointed you to where to fish. So many times we put so much effort, investments in areas where God hasn't pointed us to fish. So as leaders, we have to pray to God so that God directs us and directs our mission individually where he wants us to fish. That's the only way we will be successful to carry out his mission.
Amen. I got a question. I don't know. In discipleship and mentorship, how well do we think as a church or as a community we're supposed to encourage people, especially up and coming leaders, when looking at how Christ was able to mentor or raise the kind of people that the disciples they called. So I'm asking, what are the lessons that we can pick in mentoring, and how God's relationship with Peter, or Jesus Christ's relationship with Peter, and during his mentorship time while Christ was still alive. I don't know if my question is clear enough.
Yes, it is. I'd love to give several examples with the relation between Peter and Jesus. I think as mentors, being as the current leaders, we sometimes have a problem of one characteristic that comes with a born leader is, like Dr. Baruch always says, you think of the worst case scenario, you come up with a contingency plan, and you make sure that doesn't happen. Unfortunately, as a mentor to a mentee, the problem is when you solve problems for people, they never get to learn how to solve those problems. We can see in our churches that once you are gone, or once you take the back seat, even for a day, it can be chaos. Why? Because us as leaders, we solve every single problem, and we don't let them have to learn how to solve those problems on their own. So they are so dependent on us. Now with Christ, he did not do that. There are two examples. The first one of Peter. When Peter saw Christ, after they thought it was a ghost and all that, and he said, "If it's you, may I come to you?" Christ knew if Peter doubted, he would start to drown. But even with him knowing that he can be given the power from the Father to command the ocean or the sea or the lake not to consume Peter if he starts to doubt or looks aside or anything of that sort, he let Peter learn the lesson. But he stood there waiting to help. Once Peter realized what he had done, he knew where to look up to, and Jesus strengthened him and pulled him up. There, Peter would never make the same mistake again because he learned the lesson. He knows what should be done and what not to be done. The other example out when Jesus sent them out to minister, some came back very angry. Some came back with bad reports of how they were treated, how they were received, and all that. Christ did not go with them, but he let them go so that they could learn. They had been watching him preach and minister, and he sent them to practice. So as leaders, we have to learn to let those that we are leading practice what they are observing from us, so that when we leave as leaders, we have done our job as mentors to the next leadership that comes. We shouldn't do everything ourselves and not let others learn what to do in as leaders as well.
I also just wanted to add on to what Brother Nguni said. Sometimes you do everything correct, but the leading still does not happen in that we are called to service, and sometimes if leading is coming from personal, from a personal a place where you want to just put yourself in power for your own gratification, you are not called necessarily. So God may not be choosing you to be the person to lead. So sometimes, even though all the steps are carried out, it's not all the time that it follows through, that the training has worked. So I think we should also keep that in mind. Are there any other contributions?
I want to add on the point that you've just said. I think it is very it is very important to understand where and how you're called to lead, because you might not be called to lead as the head deacon, but you can lead from any other position. So this generation, basically, we suffer from the point where we want to be in the forefront, and then so at the end of the day, it comes back to you. Even if you say glory to God, we all know where this is going. But the point is, now you can even lead from the point where you are, because at the end of the day, it's your life. So wherever you're put in service, you are still leading. So I wouldn't think there's a point whereby some people are literally like put aside, say, we'll mentor these ones because they seem outspoken and they might take the actual sport and all of these things. I think it's a capacity where everybody has to learn all of these things, because either way, you're going to be like, when you're meeting your friends or when you're evangelizing and all of these things, you're not going to say pastor knows this verse well when you're in left care, it's some point, and you are in a Bible study. There's no point where you're gonna call Pastor Rui and say, he explained this and better. You are supposed to do that, because I do believe God has given you the might and so forth. So it might not be actually a position, but I do believe that even the way we do things, that's where leadership starts.
So let me like sort of even draw the question here. Do we think our leaders in churches or even leaders around are good at giving their mentees second chances, and not basically the way they handle the failures of their mentees? How do you think, if you've been under any sort of leadership, does any one of us have any experience, or even generally when we see people leading people, are they as forgiving, as open to failures of the people they are leading and all that?
I think to address this one, maybe from the island's perspective, people kind of treat, there's a point where people treated leadership as rehearsal, like, oh, I'm just standing in, and the church is not as big as back home, and so forth. And most of us are literally like, we're from maybe Adventist families, but we never literally had a chance to really stand for our faith by ourselves. So I do believe the challenge is the fact that it's sinking in that we are the church, no one else. If you're not the one who's doing it from wherever you are, it doesn't necessarily mean it only has to be you, but then it's basically us. So if we do not do anything, we're not going to have, of course we have our shepherd, we have our leader, the pastor, but then at the end of the day, he even came later on, but then we still kept on doing things by ourselves, because God has already equipped us. So I feel like we're a bit shaky, because we're not understanding that we are the church that we're supposed to be, and we're not rehearsing anything. We are the actual people. That's how I can address this.
Thank you. I also think I want to add on to that by saying I think we begin to lose it when we start assessing leadership as perfection. We, in as much as we are supposed to lead by example in making decisions that are going to impact people in a very positive way, we are prone to make mistakes, and it's also part of the learning curve. Even if you are a leader in a position right now who's supposed to have who's supposed to have a trainee under you, you're still prone to make mistakes yourself. So I think if we start looking at it from a position of, once someone makes a mistake, it's a strike out, we are also starting to lose it. It becomes more of a, I am the ultimate leader, and I have minions beneath me that are supposed to learn. Otherwise, they're eliminated, which is not the service we're trying to bring.
Also, if I'm to add on, I think from the study we had of Peter, Peter became the leader that he became after he denied Christ, when he realized his imperfections as a leader and begged for forgiveness. As a leader, when you realize that you're not perfect, like Brother Tojoku is saying, how do you treat those that are those that you're mentoring when they make mistakes? When you realize you're not perfect and realize other people can also make mistakes, your duty only as a mentor is to correct and show the way how it should be done, and let them try again and see if they can do it. Only that way then we can develop each other as biblical leaders, both spiritually and in the general leadership skill that you need to lead people. For example, the example I gave when the disciples came back with after going and it was sort of a disaster, Christ talked to them and they understood. But when they went again, and we can see throughout their ministries, they never repeated the same mistakes. Because why? God gave them a second chance. He showed them what they did wrong and how they were supposed to do it. He didn't say, okay, you guys have failed, so I'm going to look for the disciples. No. He treated them with kindness and love and helped them understand where they went wrong and what they should have done to be successful in what they had been sent to do. So as leaders, we also have to learn that as much as we also make mistakes, anybody else can make mistakes. And it is our job to pray for each other and help each other in this Christian life, because we all can make mistakes at any time. So we shouldn't treat others badly or judge others because of the mistakes that they might do as they try to be biblical leaders.
You know, the reason why I'm asking this question is because I know it's a thing. Um, I've been in some gatherings where some leaders have messed up, and I know we're supposed to also lead with love, and it's not for me to judge if the leader was leading or his mentees with love or anything, but I know Jesus Christ also sort of chastised or even spoke harshly or sort of like Peter, when he said, "Get thee behind me," and all that. So there were all those things. But then we've seen, I've seen in some places where I know biblically that's not even the way to even, treat people. Where you basically, strip the way we do our own things. Okay, strip people of all their titles and all that. That's left to the church, I know, and but everything. But then what comes after that is the question, because those in such instances, those people are left vulnerable, and it might not be your fault that if they fall prey to the devil's tricks and all that to draw them away. But then it might also be the church's fault in not providing love or showing concern to such people after that has been done. So I think love is important, and even for the person, for the leader or the mentee or someone who is undergoing leadership, who has been sort of reprimanded, he also needs to draw close to God. Like I think in the study, the brother said Peter had a proximity, no matter the circumstance and no matter his age, he had a close proximity with God as well. So I believe that also helps such people to deal with such situations when they are being reprimanded by their mentors, and also the mentors who are doing what they are doing also need to do it with love and with also I think affection has to be there as well, because if I'm leading my child on, I need to also show affection. We are brought up in an environment where you have to use the cane, and you don't need to show the smile, you don't need to show the love. You have to instill strict discipline, and you don't have to do with a smile or anything. So that has even crept into how we deal with other things outside of the home, outside of the family. So I just feel like we also as leaders, when we should, even if we are not giving room for mistakes, or even though we're giving room for mistakes, there's need for us to actually ask God for wisdom and direction and seek the face of God when we're doing this, and show love at the same time.
Okay, thank you so much. Are there any more questions or contributions or additions? I'd like to thank Brother Chileleko for the powerful presentation. I know we've all learned something. Let's go out there and be better leaders because of it.